Welcome. Thank you so much for coming to my talk, a postmortem on the original Broken Sword game released in 1996. I've really enjoyed putting it together. I hope that you will find this interesting. If not, I'll be looking at sort of eyes, and if you start glazing over, then I'll know to get a move on. So my name is Cecil. I'm the founder and the CEO of Revolution Software. And I'm going to talk about the opening ideas, initial ideas of Broken Sword, how we reached there, and then a little bit about what happened afterwards. But to kick off, Broken Sword came into conception as, there's a sort of common theme, because in many ways a lot of the best ideas do, over a bottle of very fine wine, at a very nice restaurant in the King's Road in London, Chelsea in London. And I was sitting with a couple of friends, my girlfriend at the time, Noreen Carmody, who was one of the founders of Revolution, and a fellow called Sean Brennan, who was the vice president at Virgin. And we were in the process, we were very close to finishing a game called Beneath the Steel Sky, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And I love the idea, I still do love the idea of writing an adventure game with hieroglyphs. So I'd come up with this idea about some sort of Egyptian game, and I pitched it, or I started pitching it to Sean. And the first thing he said was, Egyptian games don't sell. What's next? And that was it. That was it. It just dismissed the whole idea. And I'm sure they were very wise words, and I'm sure that he was right. But Sean had just finished reading a book called Foucault's Pendulum by Umberto Eco. And it featured the Knights Templar, and we started talking about the Knights Templar. I knew a little bit about them. And as we started speaking, it became clear that they had this amazing history that would actually form a great basis of an adventure game. And that, on that day, back in about 1993, was when Broken Sword, as such, came to birth. But I'd like to jump back about 10 years to talk a little bit about the genesis. And talk about my very beginnings of the industry, when I was lucky enough to get involved in a publishing company, Arctic Computing, back in 1981. Now, in the UK and France, not so much Germany and the US, which was more Commodore-based, but we were very Sinclair-based. And the first computer that really came to the public knowledge was the ZX81, which had a whopping 1K of memory. And my first game for this, imaginatively titled Adventure B. And you won't be surprised to hear that we didn't go to a professional graphic artist to get this packaging put together. I used Electroset from the local shop and drew this really crappy icon of an Arctic truck, which really has nothing to do with computer games at all. And for those of you who have played some of these games, they're very basic. Now, I was absolutely inspired by Indiana Jones, which had come out a few years earlier, and this was kind of like an homage to Indiana Jones. So when it says, I'm in a jungle clearing, in my mind, you were in this extraordinary jungle clearing with these massive trees towering above you, a leafy floor. You had dappled lights, you had the sounds of parrots. But in a game like this, you are in a jungle clearing. I can see exits to the south, I can see a branch. And what would happen is that, some of you will already know, but you basically typed in a verb and then a noun, so get, stick. I mean, one of the things that is slightly embarrassing about all of this is, if I can find the clicker, is I think most of you will realise that there should be an apostrophe between the N and the T. And it was pointed out that chisel is not spelt with a Z. The level of spelling in particular of these games was absolutely appalling. But the passion from people who just love this new form of entertainment, it was absolutely extraordinary. I then followed this up with, can anybody guess what the next game was called? There you go. Nothing if not predictable. And it was, forgive me for this story, which I was sort of loath to tell, but I'm going to anyway, because I can't help myself. But in the parsers, people used to get really frustrated because you knew what you wanted to do, but the bloody thing wouldn't understand it. So people would inevitably type obscenities, fuck. And Adventure C would come up with, if you type fuck, there's plenty of opportunity to do this later. Which I thought was wonderful in a sort of puerile, early 20s kind of way. And the payoff was when you ended up in an Android pleasure room, you could type, fuck Android, which is none of the game, not the part of the game at all, and it would come up with some comments about how stupid you were. But I got into big trouble because a kid was playing this, and he typed this in, and his mother was watching him, and she got absolutely furious, and probably quite reasonably. And the game got pulled from the shelves. And that was kind of the beginning of the decline of my particular adventure writing career at that particular moment for that time. So what I'd like to do is jump 5 years further forward. I was the development director at Activision, based in the UK. And I remember well meeting a producer who was very impressed when he heard that I'd written Adventure B. And he started describing it. He said, I remember that opening moment so well. You're standing in a forest, great big trees around you, the dappled light, the sound of the parrots squawking in the background. And I looked at him in disbelief because, of course, I knew I'd written none of this. I'd imagined it. And it kind of showed what an amazing medium we were in, that you could write, I am in a jungle clearing, and people would fill in so much of that themselves. And the thing about Activision was that it distributed a lot of adventure games. But at the time, King's Quest V was being extraordinarily successful. And, coming from an adventure background, I looked at this a little bit jealously because they weren't doing that much more than we were doing. And the thing about these King Quest games, and many of the Sierra games, is, my God, they took themselves seriously. So here you had King Graham of Daventry. Now, Daventry, does anybody come from Daventry, by the way? No, good. Daventry is this dreadful little place that is not too far from Luton Airport. And the only thing that Daventry has that sets it aside is that the Boeings fly over and drop their aerofuel before they land. It's just not the place where a king, who wouldn't be called Graham anyway, not that there's anything wrong with the name Graham, but the whole thing just didn't resonate. And a couple of things happened, but Activision got into big trouble. This was the Activision before this Activision, in the US, and I was made redundant. But they told me that, could I work for 2 days a week and then have 3 days doing my own stuff? What a perfect opportunity. I decided that I would never have a better opportunity, so I went back into development and founded Revolution. And the aforementioned Sean Brennan, who we later worked with, actually drove and said that if we came up with a prototype, then they would support that, which was absolutely fantastic. So our first game was a game called Lyra the Temptress, which was we started in 1990 and was released in 1992. Simon here, sitting in the front row, described it, I think, as, what was it? One of the best adventures ever written, or... I could describe this in one word, superb, I think. And I didn't actually know him in those days. But it was kind of looking back. It's quite interesting from, I hope, to all of you, but to me that it was very text-based. So the scenario is basically you're this guy and you can give commands to this little subservient fellow. And you could string commands together. So you could say, tell rat pouch to go to, and then it would list all the places that you either knew about because you had been there or that you'd seen through over walls or through cracks in walls. And you could build up basically very complex string of commands. And the game was very well received. It was aimed at the ST, so it had 16 colours. And the style was very much based around that. One of the things that Revolution's always done is, I had a profound dislike for the way that women were being depicted in video games in the 90s. It was really, truly shocking. So as a kind of knee-jerk reaction to that, we had very strong female characters, which made the games better. So it's kind of ironic that the game was called Lyra the Temptress. And I'd like to briefly tell you about that. We were working with a company called Mirrorsoft at the time. And I was asked, the game had a working title of, I think, Vengeance or something equally crappy. And they asked for some names towards the end. And I came up with a load and then put Lyra the Temptress. It's a shame we can't call it. And of course, they came back and said, it has to be called Lyra the Temptress because it's such a great name. And I said to the marketing people, I agree with you, but there are two problems. There's no luring and there's no temptress. And to be fair, they turned around and said, well, if we gave you another 3 months or 4 months, could you put them in? I went, okay. So we'd almost finished the game, and we were given extra time to make the game fit with the title. And that's the kind of thing that happened in the 90s. It was amazing. We then went on and wrote a game called Beneath the Steel Sky. We teamed up with a really lovely and a very talented comic book artist called Dave Gibbons, who co-wrote and drew the art for Watchmen. And I would describe the scenes from a design perspective, and then he'd do rough sketches, which were then painted by somebody else. And that gave it a kind of very raw feel, which very much reflected the themes that were in the game. And at this point, we were working with Virgin. And Virgin were amazing because they had so much energy, where everybody was running around buzzing. It was only a few years later we wondered why everybody was buzzing. But anyway, nevertheless, they were buzzing. And so you'd arrive as a developer, and everybody was so excited. The salespeople would come along and talk about what they planned to do, the marketing people, the production people, the producer. And you went from place to place, and there was this energy and a real excitement, and it was an extraordinary partnership that I valued enormously at the time. And as all of these things, I mean, Virgin actually came to an end a few years later, but during that time I have very, very fond memories. And so as we came to the end of Beneath the Steel Sky, I'd made an appointment to meet with Sean, and Sean took us out for dinner. I'd come up with this Egyptian game, as you know, which he shot down in flames, and Broken Sword was what came out of it. Just to explain this particular face, our product manager, Sarah Ewing, was very excited by the game, and found a photo of a guy who was on death row, apparently. And I have no idea what happened to him. I have no idea what his name is. But this kind of manic look came from a real person who was about to die. That sort of iconic artwork, which very much was directed by Virgin, came from that. So I want to talk a little bit about the inspiration, because Broken Sword, and you really shouldn't do this, was very much led by the backstory, which breaks every single rule in the book. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about the backstory in 30 seconds. The game, for those who've played it, and I would imagine a fair few of you have, uses the Knights Templar as a backstory, which was absolutely not cliched back in the early 90s. I will, from time to time, refer to the Broken Sword's nemesis, the Da Vinci Code, but more of that later. But at the time, this felt very, very fresh. And on one hand, they were knights, and they were very poor. They were monks. They gave all their money to the order. On the other, they were the most extraordinary warriors, and absolutely vital in the Crusades. They weren't allowed to retreat unless they were outnumbered at least 3-1. And interestingly, they built very strong relationships with the Muslim armies, who the Muslims and the Arabs were incredibly educated relative to the Christians. And a lot of culture came back from the Muslims through the Knights Templar back into Europe. And then the third element was that they were financiers. So this is what the three elements of the Knights Templar. And they invented the letter of credit. So you could go to the Knights Templar and in London, go to the Temple in London, give them your money, get a letter of credit, and then cash it in Jerusalem which meant you didn't need to take your money with you, which is obviously very successful. And that was really very much the formation of the modern banking system, and things went from there. So on one hand, you had to give all your money to the order, but on the other, the order became incredibly rich. And so the Knights Templar were absolutely vital to the Crusades in terms of the soldiering, the finance, and the espionage, the relationship they had with the enemy. But then in 1306, and here's their seal: two horses, two knights on a horse, because they were the poor knights of Christ. They couldn't afford a horse each, and of course that was absolute nonsense. But that was their seal. And then in 1307, Jacques de Molay was part of a plot between the King of France, who was Philip IV, and Clement V, Philip IV was almost bankrupt from his wars in England, desperately needed money. Clement V was the first pope to move from Rome to Avignon in France, so the popes had moved to France. And of course, it was a very cosy relationship. And on Friday the 13th of October 1307, which is where Friday the 13th comes from, still superstitious this day, they raided the temple in France, wanting to seize the treasure. And when they arrived, the treasure had gone, and it was never been found to this day. They went to La Rochelle, the deputies went to La Rochelle to seize the fleet. The fleet had already sailed, the Templars knew what was happening, and again, that's never been found to the day. What a great story! Fantastic, and nobody knew about it. It was absolutely amazing. So as I delved deeper and deeper into this, it became quite clear that there was this sort of historical zeitgeist just waiting to be unleashed. And ultimately, in 1314, on the Ile de Paris, Jacques de Mailly was burnt and cursed the King of France and the Pope, both of whom died within a year. And one of the great pleasures about writing these games and trying to stick to, as far as possible, historical elements and historical facts, is that these amazing things happen that if you tried to write them now, would not be nearly as dramatic. And remember that back in 1992, 93, 94, this was well before the internet age. So the reference material really was very, very hard to find. As I mentioned earlier, the biggest reference was probably Foucault's Pendulum, who talked about Templars, and also a book called The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. And The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail was basically on the premise, written by three English guys, on the premise that the Knights Templar had a sister organization, the Priory of Sion, and that Jesus had kids, and that those kids became the Merovingian kings of France, and that the Knights Templar the Priory of Sion came into existence to protect them. And the last member of the Priory of Sion, here's the book, The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, was a guy called Pierre Plantard. Now, Pierre Plantard was an anti-Semite who claimed to be the Grand Master of multiple secret societies. Just one of them was the Priory of Sion. The guy is a complete and utter fraud. And one of the kind of exciting things about working on this Broken Sword and future Broken Swords is the way that the serendipity of meetings and things that happen. And the way that I'm considered a lunatic because I start believing this stuff. And I genuinely do, that there's a lot more, that there are hidden truths that actually underpin all of this historical stuff. Now, more sane and more rational people say that that's nonsense. But, an example of this serendipity is that I was on holiday in the Dordogne a couple of years ago, and canoeing down the Dordogne. My wife was in a beautiful little village called Florac, and tiny little place with an art gallery. She went into the art gallery, and there was a book about the Knights Templar. She picked it up, and the French gallery owner, who spoke no English, came and asked her what her interest was, and she speaks no French, but they got talking. And it turned out that this guy was called Luc Chamoy, and this is Jean-Luc talking to Pierre Plantard back in the 70s. And somehow, in the middle of nowhere, we'd stumbled on the one person in the world that knew more than anybody else about Pierre Plantard and the whole sort of history of the Knights Templar. And Jean-Luc was great, and he opened a bottle of champagne, and we ate sausage with him and talked. And it was fascinating to hear what he had to say, but kind of always reinforcing this view of what's reasonable and what's not reasonable. And this amazing story, which, as I say, backstory, which rather foolishly drove every other aspect, meant that because of the need to research, every single family holiday was spent going to these exotic places. And what I'd like to do now is just talk about some of these places and how they fed back into Broken Sword, into the original Broken Sword. Now, the genre of the adventure, whether it be film or games, of course, is all about taking your heroes, your protagonists, to interesting locations and meeting interesting people. It's kind of what people expect. And as I say, the granddaddy of them all, which was the first Indiana Jones, did this so brilliantly. So, for example, if you go to Paris, there's an amazing place, the catacombs. The Knights Templar, as other organizations in Paris did, used the catacombs which were dug to quarry the stone for the buildings, deep underneath the streets of Paris. And there are hundreds of kilometres of these things. And the reason that, of course, when the king's men, Philip IV, came to steal the treasure, to get the treasure from the Templars, the reason, of course, it wasn't there is because they just had that direct access to these catacombs and had moved it away. And here's quite an interesting thing as well, that in the medieval times, there was a huge graveyard in a place called Lyra, which is now a tourist area. But Lyra was the main fruit and vegetable market next to this graveyard. And the graveyard was just spilling over, both metaphorically and literally. So caskets full of dead bodies would fall into this fruit. I mean, it was obviously disgusting, and they had to do something about it. So they actually hand-moved 5 million corpses and put them into this Wayam de Mort. And together with the sewers, which are very ancient as well, it kind of fired my imagination of what you could do. And I'm going to talk in a minute about our layout artist, but I mean, this is kind of what the end result was, a view of how the sewers and the catacombs would interact, because that's the way that they mixed together was the way that actually the Templars would move around. And I felt very passionate that I wanted to try and put this into the game. Likewise, at the climax of the game, you end up at a place called St Ninian's, which is a church in Scotland by the Battle of Bannockburn, which was a big... it's 1314, so it's the anniversary this year. In fact, it's the anniversary next month. And again, visiting the place, because there's no information, the internet didn't exist, I took a bit of a liberty because I discovered that this was new. This old tower had always been there, but in one of the wars, Cromwell had stored gunpowder in the main church, and the gunpowder had exploded, destroying it, and they'd rebuilt the church. So the way that I sort of rather liberally interpreted this was to take that history and to get rid of it. And then when you find your way in here, you find old barrels of gunpowder, and that's one of the puzzles at the end to blow up the baddies. Not wishing to put any spoilers in. And certainly, in exploring these places, you find these connections, which, as I say, become more and more compelling. The last example I'd like to give you is a place called Montségur, which was connected to the Templars. This is a photo that I took recently. And as you can see, the castle at the top there is incredibly remote. This is what the castle looks like at the top. And it was actually where the Cathars had their last stand. It appears in Broken Sword 5. But in the research for the original Broken Sword. And again, to give you an idea of the serendipity of the way that these things come together. At the time, in the 90s, we drove into Montségur, and it was getting dark, and there was one hotel. And they apologised because they were full, and they said, there's no more hotel, there's no other hotel in the village, you have to go to the next village, which was like 10, 15 miles away. And I was walking back, and a window flies open, and this woman, later I was called Madame Coquet, shouts, Monsieur, vous cherchez un hôtel? I said, yeah. She said, je suis un hôtel, je suis un hôtel. Yeah, and welcome. She was lovely. And of course, she hated the other hotelier, and he hated her. But it was only much more recently that I caught her at the end of a programme about Montségur and hadn't realised, because again, we just didn't see all this information. In the internet age, you would have done, that a fellow called Otto Rahn in the 30s, a German writer, had written about the Holy Grail. And his publisher asked him to come to Berlin and said that somebody wants to meet you. And it was actually Heinrich Himmler. And Himmler was obsessed by the occult. And he thought that in the way that Schliemann, 100 years earlier, had discovered Troy by looking at the Odyssey and working backwards, that he could do the same and find the Holy Grail. So this guy Otto Rahn was funded by Himmler and came to Montségur with a big contingent. And it turned out that Otto Rahn had stayed at Madame Coquette's house, and she actually remembered him because she was 6 at the time, which kind of feels amazing. And the things that, this is Otto Rahn in a Cathar a cave deep into the mountain, which we were shown by somebody very special. That's a rather sad replica of me trying to do the same thing. So the serendipity of all of these things is absolutely extraordinary and reaffirming in many ways. Now, of course, the backstory has to ultimately support the story and the gameplay. I mean, clearly the gameplay needs to lead everything. So for the adventure, what I felt was that this backstory needed to do two things. It needed to answer the question that you need to ask in an adventure game, or in a Broken Sword adventure game. What are the antagonists, the baddies, after, and why is it absolutely vital that the protagonists get there first? And secondly, it needs to create the puzzles that are going to ultimately be solved. And fairly early, I came up with a number of puzzles based around this manuscript. So if you look up here, you've got a bull's head, which is actually a location in Syria. You've got a tripod here, which you find in the game. Likewise, a jewel, a woman looking into a mirror, seeing three faces. All of these things were the puzzles that, or ultimately, they were the solutions that were going to help you solve the puzzle. And of course, in an adventure game, you want to feel smart. I mean, in any game, you want to feel smart, particularly in an adventure game. You want to feel that they are. So these were puzzles that were formed, that were put together by the original Knights Templar, so I claim, and only a Knights Templar or somebody very smart, i.e. you, the player, are going to be able to solve them. And the characters, so this was kind of what the middle was all about, and generally I was quite pleased with it. And it then allowed us to come up with the characters and how they would work. And we have two characters. We have George Sobart and Nico Collard. And it happens in telly all the time, but in a game, if you can have two characters, if it's story-based and you need to get a lot of exposition across, if you have two characters, then those characters can talk to each other. And in doing so, it moves forward the exposition. And you don't get that really clumsy, inner monologue where people talk at great length about what they've deduced. And so these were the first sketches for our character George. I wanted two characters that not only would have an affectionate relationship, but also we would be able to bring conflict, because culturally they were very different. And to me, the two biggest differences would be an American guy from California who was very laid back, and a French girl who was very driven. And as long as you give them a common objective, then I thought that you could create interesting dynamics, and then there'd be an underlying sexual tension as well in the relationship. And, love it or hate it, the game is very much driven by the relationship of George and Nico. And here we have a thing of the two of them. And it was a pleasure writing for them. They fitted in with the game, I'd like to think, really well. But the problem is, I'd written all of the middle, and I hadn't written the beginning, and I hadn't written the end, which is a recipe for disaster. Because one of the things that was really tormenting me was I loved the whole Templar history. I loved the fact that they were the good guys. And yet in my story, they were the bad guys. They had to be the bad guys, because ultimately you need antagonists at the end that our heroes, George and Nico, will come against. And there was a real breakthrough. And if any of you want to write stories, I would highly recommend a scriptwriter, a guy called Robert McKee, who lectures in London and Paris and New York and almost certainly Berlin. And he doesn't claim to be a great scriptwriter himself, but what he does is he talks about the structure on the basis that this is a structure that's worked for thousands of years. And if you break those rules, then ultimately, you do so at your peril. And the most successful stories are the ones that have this basic structure. And just listening to him, all of these things were going around in my mind. And it was at that point I realized that actually the only way to reconcile this was to have our antagonists not as proper Templars, but as neo-Templars, as Templars that took on the mantle, which then, of course, gave us the opportunity for George at the end to question them and to ask them what right they had to take this mantle up, which is what happens. And then since then, actually, since the rise of the Knights Templar in popularity, I was interested to see the other day that, or the other year that, that there's a drug cartel in Mexico called the Knights Templar. It's quite a common thing to do, and kind of all the crazy lunatics, now embrace the Knights Templar as one of their own. And so, having written quite a lot of the middle, I'd now nailed the beginning and the end. But of course, the middle supports the themes from the beginning, from the start, and then molds them so that you can have the climax at the end. And all that really matters is the beginning and the end. The middle needs to change. So it meant going back to the drawing board and actually redesigning an awful lot of the story. And by this stage, we were way, way, way behind schedule. So, let's see where we are. The other big thing is that our previous games had been, relatively low res. So the Atari ST was 320 pixels by 200 pixels in 16 color. We were now moving to the PC screen, 640 by 480 in 256 colors. We were going up by 5 times the resolution. We were going up by 16 times the number of colors. So to us, and bear in mind that this is the early 90s, this was the most immense technical leap. We'd also, by the way, gone from floppy disk to CD, which was also amazing. So everything was changing. And we brought forward a couple of very talented, but in particular one very talented sprite artist who we'd picked up very early, sprite animator, I beg your pardon, Steve Oates. And clearly, as we move forward into this, high-res 640, 480, it was very important to move from pixel art to drawn art. And, a very important moment for the project came when I'd gone to an animation college in a place called Ballyfermot in Dublin with a view to picking up some animators. And the person who showed me around was a guy called Owen Cahill. And he was very interested by games. And I showed him some of the backgrounds, and he looked and he said, "This wasn't drawn by a layout artist." No. He said, "Let me show you what I'm doing." And his stuff was absolutely extraordinary. It was so far ahead of what we were doing. And he got really excited and started talking about the tricks that you can pull with animation, the way you can throw perspective, the way that you rotate cameras. And this is one of the opening images from the first Broken Sword, Shadow of the Templars, where you're looking from a crow's eye into a gargoyle. And if anybody's interested, if you climb up, if you go to Paris, then you can climb up I was going to say Sacré-Cœur, and you can see this. And the views felt very much very, very authentic in that regard. And then what he followed it with was this particular screen where, as you can see, if we go from between the two, there you are, you're looking at it straight on, but he's drawn it at an angle. So what he directed us to do was to actually tilt the angle as we moved, and then also tilt the camera as we moved across this background of Paris. And it created an enormously dynamic feel, because the viewer knew instinctively that maybe the perspective wasn't quite right and that you were being played with, but that you were in the hands of somebody who really understood. And Owen's backgrounds were a really, really important part of that whole background. So here's one of the opening scenes. Before, and it happens all the time, people will draw boxes within boxes. And Owen was absolutely obsessed with the fact that that should never happen. So we have interesting angles here. Now, this is quite basic. It's 640, 400, so it's quite low res. And we were limited to the number. But you can see that the backgrounds are very, very dynamic. And that kind of created the sense of energy that was to go through the whole game. And he also helped us with some of the characters. Again, introducing us to cartoon people. I was very inspired by Tintin. And the reason I love Tintin is you can look at the characters and you can see who they're going to be. And inevitably they are like that. And that's kind of important in a game because you rely, like a Tintin comic book, you have very little information. You see what they look like, you get a little bit of dialogue, and you need to know how they're going to behave so that helps you then solve later puzzles. So, and as I say to our actors, it's, we want our characters to be not stereotypes, we want them to be archetypes. Now, of course, there's almost no difference, but archetype sounds good and stereotype sounds bad. But I do try and avoid the stereotypical characters. And I'd like to give you a couple of examples, because in this game, and all the games that I write, I try and write characters that I know, characters that I think are fun and would fit into the context of that particular puzzle. And indulge me for a minute. This guy is a guy called Albert, and he's the concierge. And, in my youth, travelling through France, I went to stay with a friend, and they were in a courtyard, beautiful Parisian courtyard. And as we walked, we were being very quiet, we were whispering, and this concierge came out, and he sort of wished us good evening. Then he heard we were English, and suddenly all hell broke. "How dare you make so much noise," he said, "and this is outrageous, and everyone's trying to sleep." And of course it was totally unreasonable, but I got my revenge. He appears in the first Broken Sword game as Albert the concierge. And, and then a little bit later, I remember I was in a taxi and we came into a square where a gendarme was trying to direct the traffic really badly. And everything was gridlocked. And everybody started hooting. And in the end, he got down and he went down, he sat and he had a glass of wine in the cafe. And very quickly, all the traffic cleared. And again, this wonderful character makes an appearance in Broken Sword. So I think by having characters that our weakest characters are undoubtedly the ones that we put in, and we don't know who they are, and they get parachuted in because they suit a puzzle. I mean, in many ways, the character leads what the puzzle is. And in truth, I was lucky enough to go to Paris. I like to say in the early 70s. I mean, I was born in 1962. It might have even been the late 60s with my mother. And England back in those days was a really, really depressed place. We were a lot poorer than the rest of the continent. Everything sort of was quite grey. So to come to Paris was extraordinary as a young child. The food, the smells, the Gitan and the Gauloise rather than the Benson and Hedges, the fact that even the men wore perfume. I mean, that was outrageous. That was distinctly dubious in our view at that time. That they drank water. In England, we drank milk. So, and so in many ways, this Broken Sword and all the Broken Swords is a very affectionate view of Paris, trying to capture that moment, that surprise, that vibrancy and that colour. Now, obviously Lyra the Temptress, Beneath the Steel Sky had been pretty innovative at the time and were very well received. As well as going into the mainstream, I tried to innovate as well. Some of that worked, some of that didn't. One of the things that I have learned, and I would pass on to anybody who's interested in development, is that your audience loves innovation. You can afford to make mistakes, as long as they're not stupid mistakes and they're not too bad. People would much prefer to have innovation so that something feels fresh, the game feels fresh, than to make it very derivative. And I'd like to give you a couple of examples. The first one was death. Very few adventure games had allowed you to kill your main player, in fact, virtually none. And I was very keen to put the player under pressure, to give the sense that actually there was a real threat. And so, but the trouble was that you couldn't die until about a quarter of the way through the game. So a lot of people played the game expecting it to be a normal adventure, and then they died about a quarter of the way through, and they were surprised, and they hadn't bloody well saved. So we got an awful lot of flack for that. Another design decision that I don't regret, but was quite important at the time, was that when we were writing these adventures, you had a whole group of people that understood the grammar absolutely, and so they would play through these games really, really fast. And then you had normal folk who just played the games because they enjoyed them. There was a real diverse, group of people playing. And, of course, the people who understood the grammar were by far the most vocal, and they would complain that games were too short and too easy. I'm not sure that much changes. And so I thought, right, the way to do it is to put in just one really, really, or two really nasty, difficult puzzles. So, fucking goat. Brilliant, thank you. That's... Excellent, good. Well, it's nice to see that, I knew that I'd arrived a few years ago when I got into a taxi in London. And taxi drivers in London, apart from charging you too much, they also just insist on talking. And this guy, I had quite a lot to do. And the guy said, "Oh, what do you do then, Gov?" I said, "I write video games," which is normally a really good way to end a conversation. I went, "Oh, I play video games." And I said, "Yeah, I'm sure you play Call of Duty and Tomb Raider, yeah." He says, "Well, I've heard of any of yours." I went, No. He went, go on, try me. I said, I wrote a game called Broken Sword. And he looked round at me and he said, "So you're that bastard that put the goat in, are you?" Felt very proud. And of course, the reason that the goat went in, I mean, for those who haven't played the game, there's a plough here, and what you have to do is you have to be butted by the goat, and then while you're on the ground, you need to click on the plough, pull the plough across. If you've already stood up, it's too late. The goat comes and chases you and gets tangled up. And of course, the reason that this problem was unfair was because we put in a new game mechanic, or we changed the game mechanics quite subtly, but quite importantly, midway through the game. So it was desperately unfair, but it did stop everybody in their tracks. The problem, of course, is that for the vast majority of people who played these games just normally, it was absolutely bewildering. What happened more recently is that a group of fans came up with something called the Order of the Goat, and produced these goats by hand. And this goat was actually in celebration of the original goat puzzle, so I guess it's not all too bad. So, as I say, the game took much longer than we'd anticipated, not least because I was poncing about changing the story, adding an intro, and always wanting to tinker it with it, which is of course, a recipe for disaster. And Virgin were very, very supportive. They really wanted this to be a big, big title. So the game got bigger and bigger. Owen was very talented and produced these backgrounds, but remarkably slowly. And because there was so much work that went into them. And he was based in Dublin, so he'd phone up almost inevitably at 6 o'clock. And he'd drive the team to despair because he would not stop talking. Now, they got very frustrated. I realized that actually, by being challenged by somebody who was so talented in his area, actually it would make the game a lot better. So in the end, I basically said that he had to speak to me only, because one, I would actually do something, and two, I had people threatening to walk out if they had to speak to Owen later. But as we fell behind, so Virgin started to lose confidence. The game was going way over budget. It was going way over schedule. Actually, to be honest, there was no budget. The budget had never been set. But we were going way over schedule, and it was costing lots. And there were kind of whispers that, if we didn't pull our socks up, then the game was going to get cancelled. And then you reach, as everybody who's a developer, and almost all of you will have gone through this sort of mid-late term, where you actually lose all your interest in the game. You hate it. But the key thing is that the passion that existed from the beginning has to be carried forward. And as the director, that is very much your role. So thankfully, while we all got really fed up with this game, we all hated it, we still had a passion for the initial vision, and a passion and a pride and an ambition for the game. And of course, you go through the stupid crunch times, and of course you have all the shouting and the screaming and girlfriends that walk out on you because you never go and see them and all this sort of stuff. And it's just, unfortunately, it's the way that game development happens and still happens, and I'm not quite sure. Obviously, in an ideal world, it wouldn't. But as we reached the end, particularly Sarah, who was our brand manager, and Sean, who's been a great champion, realized that actually this game had huge potential. And they started getting excited, and they started coming up to see us, and they started showing us artwork. And this particular artwork, the one I showed you before, what we'd done, and in a retail environment, it seems so kind of old-fashioned to talk about it now, but in a retail environment, it was vital that you attracted the attention of the audience. So what we used to do was cut this out and put it on a dummy box and just stick it into the local game store. And one, you could see whether it stood out, but two, more importantly, you'd see whether people actually were interested. And the great thing about this box art is that people came, and inevitably they'd look at it, they would look at the back, because you'd look to the front to get the track, and then you'd look at the back for the screenshots. And it was at that point we'd point out it was a dummy box. But the box was actually really, really successful because of this incredibly powerful image. And, the morale rose. And it was clear that actually we had, something that could be, if we got all the components right, quite special. I was lucky enough to cast a guy called Rolf Saxon. Notice he gets the golden goat, not me. I got a normal one. Rolf plays our George Stobart. And he was very keen to meet beforehand, and we always do now, to talk about the story and the character. And he would question elements of the dialogue if he felt that they weren't right, if he felt that the exchange with Nico maybe wasn't affectionate enough, or that we're conveying the wrong thing. And it would take like the best part of a day, which again would have been very frustrating, except that he gave really good feedback. And then when we went into the studio, the other actors instinctively knew that he really, really was in command. He knew what the story was meant to be. He knew all about these characters. And his confidence, his knowledge, drew the rest of the actors along. And we actually got really, really good performances. Rolf also deals very well with his fans. I mean, he was in Impossible Mission. He's been in, Mission Impossible, I beg your pardon. He's been in a lot of really, Saving Private Ryan. He's been in a lot of films. But as he points out, it's actually Broken Sword that he has by far the most of his fan base have come from. And having him as our main character, a really talented actor, lovely guy who was happy to lead the other actors, was really valuable. And our music was created by a fellow called Barrington Phelan. Again, by chance, I guess this theme of serendipity. I'd actually played cricket with him 5 years earlier, before when he was a junior, quite young composer. And we shared this passion for playing cricket. Well, he had a passion and I played. And we became really good friends and then lost touch. And then when I needed somebody to write the music, he kind of felt like the obvious person. And he came up to York, and we had just a really, really good time. He was very much in love with this girl that he was later to marry. And she was a great adventure fan. And so she would play through the game again and again and again. And as well as feeding us back comments and finding bugs, she would then write the cue sheet, which she would then compose from the videos. And it worked brilliantly well. And Barry will always talk about the interactive music. Now, whether the music it's interactive in that if you go into certain locations, then the music will change if you return in certain events. But it's not kind of interactive in the way that we now think of as interactive music. But there were like 3 or 4 hours of music. There was 3 or 4 times what you'd expect in a normal film score. And he really threw himself in and had a great deal of passion for the game. And the thing about an adventure game, and I guess probably all games, is that the end result is much more than the sum of the parts. And by that, I mean you've got elements that are good, but when they all come together, the end result is much better than all of those parts added together. And likewise, when they don't come together, then of course a game is a lot worse than the sum of the parts. So we now were on an absolute high. The game, everybody loved the game. And it was time to see the press. And in those days, what would happen is that you would agree to give a copy of the game a month early, before it was ready, so that when it shipped, it would be the reviews would be there. So the game was given to a magazine called PC Zone, which doesn't exist anymore. And they played through it, and Virgin told us that, that was great. Couldn't wait. Day and date, the game was going to launch at the same time that PC Zone shipped. They absolutely slagged us off. It was the most appalling review. It talked about the fact that the game was full of bugs. It talked about the fact that it didn't feel finished. We were absolutely devastated. We were upset because this was like 2-3 years of our work. But also it felt so profoundly unfair that a publisher should agree with this distinctly dubious idea that they review it before it's finished and take into account. And this reviewer had taken not one bit of notice. He hadn't been told. And as you can imagine, when your first review is out, and it's the first review, and because they've got an exclusive, they're a month ahead of everybody else, then you realise that actually, you have huge doubts, and both ourselves and Virgin had big doubts about whether the game would be successful or not. Thankfully, the next lot of reviews were really fantastic, and we basically got Adventure of the Year from most magazines. We got 9 out of 10 from Edge, and thankfully the poor review that we'd had from PC Zone was absolutely reversed. And, frankly, and a month later, nobody cared and nobody remembered. But it was quite sort of shocking at the time. And how am I doing for time? Oh, not very well. At the time, the PlayStation had just come out, and it was this shiny, new, wonderful, this is PlayStation 1, PSX had come out, wonderful, shiny console, incredibly exciting, 3D. And we pitched the game to Virgin, and they told us that they had no interest whatsoever. So approached Sony directly. And it was championed by one fellow, because there wasn't much interest, because the general thought was that it should be 3D and it should be visceral. John Roberts was his name, and then later Martin Alltimes. And we eventually managed to get them to accept it. And didn't have very high expectations. But the game, again, got 9 out of 10 from all the official PlayStation magazines around Europe. Sold 500,000 copies. I mean, it was a huge success. Totally unexpectedly, totally counterintuitively. And that kind of cemented the game, which allowed us then to produce, sequels. But it was only actually relatively recently that we heard directly from fans. Because of the idea that you as a developer would write a game for a publisher, and the publisher would then sell it to a retailer, and the retailer would sell it to the public, we actually never got any of the feedback directly. And it was only when we had the chance to to kickstart Broken Sword 5, and for the first time talk directly to our fans, did we have the most wonderful stories from people. And I'm going to briefly, again, forgive me for indulging me in this, tell you a couple of stories. And these are stories that would have been sent to the retailers or the publishers and would have gone to a pile for a fairly junior person to either apply or not. It would have been. But the amount of passion that came through, there was one guy who wrote, about a year ago to talk about why he wanted to support Broken Sword, because he had a very deep relationship with his grandmother, who was now dead. But the grandmother had taken him in when he was about 10 into a game store, and of course they'd bought Broken Sword. And the relationship for 6 months was all about Broken Sword. He'd come back as soon as he could from school, and he'd play the game with his grandmother, and when they got stuck, they would talk about what had happened, and they'd talk about the characters, and it was a relationship that the game had defined. It just cemented this very, very intense relationship, and facilitated it. And I was thrilled to read this. I was delighted, in a way that we wouldn't have done. We would have never been able to. And another about a lad who talked about the relationship he'd had with his brother, and they used to quote lines from Broken Sword. They'd play the game again and again. And they would joke about the jokes, and they would quote jokes to each other. And this younger brother idolized his older brother, who then drowned in a quarry, went swimming and drowned. And again, he wrote to say how important Broken Sword was to the relationship with his older brother and the memories that he had. Which is why I feel that as an industry, we're really not very good at all at talking about the huge passion that as a collective we produce amongst gamers. And in the UK we have the most appalling newspapers, some of them, who write dreadful things which are just so unfair about the industry. And I think we need to sort of kind of shout a little bit about the good bits. And we were lucky enough to have the opportunity to write a director's cut of Broken Sword in 2008, actually, for Ubisoft, who published it on Wii and DS. And it was great to be able to address some of the... and some purists felt that actually we were tampering with it too much, and they may well be right. It was great for me to be able to actually adjust, because there were elements that when we finished and sat back that, particularly in the story, there were huge holes. Like, for those of you who've played it, how on earth did the baddies, the antagonists, get to the church before George and Nico? When George and Nico have the manuscript and certain parts, components, it makes no sense. Nobody noticed it at the time, but the only reason that I really struck me was because when we were approached by a film studio and I wrote a treatment, I realized that actually a lot of these things just didn't make sense at all because they've been written for a game rather than a linear medium. So the other thing that's kind of struck as we went forward was that it was clear that we were dancing in the same paths as Indiana Jones. And many of the themes, this idea of the history that resonates into the modern day. So, of course, the Last Crusade has Knights Templar, which overlaps with us, and the Crystal Skulls, which is obviously not the greatest film in the world, but overlaps in terms of the Mayan mythology that appeared in Broken Sword too. And it kind of changed my view towards development. Clearly, a backstory should never drive the story. It should be, or they should be driven in parallel. So as we write new games, what I tend to do is get excited about a backstory, write a 2-page summary of the story so you can make sure that the emotional beats stay there. And independently of that, write a game design document. And that game design document's really looking for great gameplay moments where all of the things come together in a crescendo, in a climax. And really, in many ways, those three stay separate for quite a long time because we need to make sure that, one, we have compelling backstory that will drive the puzzles and create the answer to what are the antagonists after and why must what are the antagonists after and why must the protagonist stop them? How do you create the puzzles? And then drive the story and the gameplay. And one of the things that I'm proud of for this Broken Sword 1 when we reinvented it is that it's still very well received, 91% Metacritic on iPhone. And bearing in mind that this is like 15, 16 years later. And the game, according to the reviewers at least, still stacks up. Now, I've got about 2 minutes, and I'd like to very briefly talk about... I did promise that I'd mention the Da Vinci Code. And our fans are absolutely convinced that Dan Brown must have played Broken Sword. Because if I give you the synopsis for those of you who haven't read the Da Vinci Code, it's an American comes over to Paris, meets a sassy French girl, they get caught up in a conspiracy involving the Knights Templar, and they almost get killed. And the final story I'd like to tell you is, totally ironically, I was asked by Take-Two to get involved with the game of the film of the book a few years ago. And I have to say, it was a great pleasure, but... and I was very flattered, but it wasn't something I probably wasn't going to do it. And then Take-Two phoned up and said, look, we're in big trouble. You've got to fly over to Los Angeles. You've got to meet with Ron Howard. And you've got to convince him that this game's going to be great. And I said, but I'm not sure it is going to be great. He went, forget about that. Just turn up. The fact that you're there is all that matters. So, I felt very special flying over Virgin, get off Los Angeles, go to this wonderful studio, Imagine Productions. And in various people walks, and then the great Ron Howard walks in. And he says, look, guys, I'm really sorry to waste your time, but I don't think there should be a game because it's going to interfere with the film. And the senior vice president, who'd met me, lovely woman, and said, Charles, just sit at the back. You just don't need to say anything. Just sit at the back. The fact that you're here is really important. Okay. I'm sorry, guys. And this woman says, Ron, these guys have signed a contract. There's going to be a game. He says, okay, I can accept that. So she says, they put a lot of money into the film. It's really helped the film. There's going to be a game. Okay, he says, no marketing. Ron, these guys have put a lot of money in, and there has to be marketing. Okay. In that case, it has to come 6 months after the film. Ron, it's not going to be 6 months after the film. It's going to be day and date, and these guys are going to market. So, what are you going to do with my story? She looks him in the eye and she says, Ron, I'm so pleased you asked that question because we've flown this guy all the way from England who's going to tell you what we're going to do with the story. So I'm looking around the room and everyone's looking at me and I go, this was not meant to happen at all. So Ron looks at me and he says, so who the hell are you anyway? And what have you got to do with this? What do you know about the Knights Templar? I said, well, I went to a Templar ceremony in Worcester. I'd been invited 6 months earlier. by this group calling themselves the Knights Templar to a wonderful ceremony. So, I could give him that. And he said, so where do you come from? I said, I come from the city of York in England, which, of course, is where Constantine the Great was coronated, and I bet none of you knew that. The great Constantine, who went to found Constantinople, was actually declared emperor in York, in England. So he kind of got really excited by all this stuff. He went, wow. So what are you going to do with the story? And I knew I was on a high at this point. So I said, Ron, we're going to take the symbolism. He went, I love it. There was a silence. He went, what kind of symbolism? I go, oh, Jesus Christ. And I said, Ron, as you all know, in medieval paintings, the Virgin Mary is always depicted in blue because that was a dye that was more expensive and their faces change, and Mary Magdalene is always in red. And so even though the situations and everything changes, the symbolism of the colour. And he turned around to Akiva Goldsman and he said, Akiva, I love it. I love it. He said, Sophie Neveu, she's walking out of Rosslyn Chapel and she's wearing a shawl. And I'm looking in absolute disbelief that actually, this is all true, but it's great. And Akiva says, that's genius. That's genius. And he looks at me and says, what colour was it? I said, red for Mary Magdalene. And if you do watch the film, indeed, Mary Magdalene is wearing a shawl when she comes out of Rosslyn Chapel and all the other things. I did look for my name in the credits, but sadly it wasn't there. So that kind of, again, is to try and get this theme of the serendipity of the fact that actually all of these things come together. The interesting thing about the film, whether you like it or not, or the book, whether you like it or not, is that the researcher came from UCLA, and I met him. Ron asked me to stay and talk to these guys. And a lot of the information he got was by Googling. So they were looking for symbolism, and they were coming up with connections that actually, in the truth of this world, didn't actually make an awful lot of sense. And I wonder, the film got quite mediocre reviews. I think it was perfectly well made. But it was made from the perspective of the story. It wasn't made from the perspective of what actually made the book so successful, which was the idea of the spirituality. And that's very much what I've tried to capture throughout this first Broken Sword and the ones that followed. I've horribly run out of time. I'm really sorry. There were meant to be some questions. Please leave if you want to. If you want to ask any questions, is there anybody about to throw me out? Oh, dear. Okay, so anyway, I really do apologise for running a couple of minutes over. But if we could have if there are any questions, then I'd be delighted to answer them. And please do feel free to leave, and I won't be offended. I would have been before now.
So, Charles, great talk, thank you. My name's Chris Zalaski. I'm giving a talk tomorrow about film narrative techniques for game design. But my question today is more about your passion, because I always, as a teacher, game developer, I always tell everyone that it's a personal passion and sort of this real immersion through research into your topic that creates a very authentic experience for your audience. And can you reflect on that? Because a lot of the research that you did was actually through your own personal holidays that you went on, and how you ended up communicating that passion to your team as well.
Well, my view is that if you don't believe it as the writer, then there's absolutely no way that the audience will. And as I said earlier, of course, when you go on holiday, some people love going to beaches. I personally find them incredibly boring. So actually going to these beautiful places in beautiful weather and meeting interesting people. When I went to Montségur, I met up with a guy called Richard Stanley, who has written, he's actually a filmmaker and has a great deal of passion, meeting with Luc Chamoy. All I can say, and it's a great question, which I'm going to give a rather bad answer to, all I can say is that I believe that as long as I can make it exciting, as long as I'm excited, as long as I believe in those characters, as long as I believe the story works, then hopefully I can convey some of that. If I'm not interested, then it will be really dull. Absolutely, there's nothing I can do at all. And as I mentioned earlier, some of the worst characters that we have in our games are ones which fitted a puzzle, but actually we didn't know who they were. So I shall look forward. I shall try and come to your talk tomorrow, and I shall look forward to hearing what you have to say. But I do think it's all about knowing. Well, Robert McKee. Sorry, I'm going to sum it up. Robert McKee says, "Know your world." He says, "Know your world. Know it really, really well," because ultimately, and you'll probably say this tomorrow, But ultimately, you need to know an awful lot about your world than you ever convey, because if you know your world, then there will be an internal consistency. So 3/4 of it will never appear on the page. But instinctively, your audience will know that you know. And you know your world and you know your characters. And because of that, they feel fully formed. They feel, rather than just the 2D flat ones that we get in so many games. So, I mean, that opens up, of course, the question of empathy and all that stuff, but that's a different talk. But thank you. That's a great question.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm quite keen to know, at what stage of the development process does the script writing come in? Did you sort of develop, the cast of characters and locations and puzzles first, and then write the script around that, or were they going on at the same time?
Right. I think the two have to be totally interlinked. Not for the first two, but for the subsequent games, I worked very closely with a guy called Neal Richards. And Neal and I work right from the very beginning. So generally, Neal, I'll write the first précis of the story. Neal, who's a better writer than I am, will then write it as a proper story. And we can read it, and then we give it to people. He will then write the scripts, but it's not really practical for a writer to write all the scripts, because ultimately the scripters have to write the dialogue to make the thing work. And so what will tend to happen is a professional writer like Neal will write the précis, work with me on the puzzles, also write the key plot scenes. The scripters then write their own dialogue, some of which is brilliant, some of which is utter rubbish. And he will then script edit that, much to their chagrin, because he takes out the jokes that they think are the funniest. But he then takes the ultimate authority, and I do as well, and we root around in their scripts. And we often, actually, the scripters come up with really, really nice stuff, which we will often leave totally untouched, or just tweak because the jokes are so good. But the key thing then is that everybody buys into the overall game design vision, so that everybody's writing the same, writing in the same direction. So to answer your question, if it's just script writing, that's kind of a little bit limiting because that comes very late. I think you really do need to work with somebody who can work at it through every stage, and not only write the in-game script, but can write the presentation documents that you kind of sell to yourselves and use as sanity check. I mean, when we wrote the first 4 games, we were working with a publisher. For Broken Sword 5, we were self-publishing it. So I felt it was really important to have an outside view. So quite regularly, we'd present to people whose opinion I trusted, and treat them as if they were the publisher, and listen to everything that they had to say. Because, my God, it's so easy to become self-indulgent. And, the criticism I would make of Sierra is that they became very self-indulgent, which is why LucasArts came along and blew them away. And to an extent ours. And they went from being absolutely everything to zero in a matter of a couple of years. And it was because they took themselves too seriously. Should we have one more? And again, because it's now 10 minutes over and I feel really guilty.
Hi. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the choice to set the game in a modern lens, looking back to history, as opposed to setting it at the current time and solving puzzles and mysteries then.
Yeah, that's thank you. As I say, I was very inspired by Indiana Jones, which is set in the 30s, but has biblical resonances. And the 30s was a very interesting era for that. But from my perspective, I wanted it to resonate with a modern audience. And I kind of felt that a modern audience would work best if it was set in the modern day, with all of and then you could bring forward the themes, the themes, whether they be the locations from medieval locations, which certainly in places like Paris and Syria, which we go to, and Spain, still exist to this day. And I just felt, rightly or wrongly, that it would be more dynamic if we could jump between the two, so that we could have all the benefits of the history and the locations from the medieval era brought forward. It also meant that I had the opportunity to actually go to these places and make them reasonably authentic. And again, as per the previous question, hopefully that authenticity, the audience would only find out a little bit of what I had discovered, but hopefully that authenticity came across in the game. I think generally for people who enjoy Broken Sword, it really does. For others, it doesn't. But that authenticity was important, and I felt I could be truer to that by setting it in the modern day. And I don't regret it. I mean, I don't. Maybe you think it would be better if it had been set in, but it was the idea of resonating with a modern audience. I'm going to call this to a close. I'm really grateful to you. Thank you for not going to sleep. And apologies that I ran over. Thank you very much.